And I would love to now, we have three great speakers. We have Mike Lavender, the Interim Policy Director at National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition. He will be followed by Dania Davey, who's Director of Land Retention and Advocacy for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. And then batting cleanup, we have Ferd Hefner, who's the principal of the Farm, Food, and Environment Consulting, which will then be followed by hopefully some really good, rigorous conversation about what we can do and what is next from this. So without further ado, Mike, I would love to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate the setup. Great to be here with you today. Great to be on this excellent panel and introduced to so many of you. Just at the risk of reiterating myself again, my name is Mike Lavender, he, him. I am the Interim Policy Director here at NSAC, based in Washington, D.C., actually based in Silver Spring, just outside of Washington, D.C., but in the NSAC office today. Really excited to be able to talk with all of you today about the IRA, bring you up to speed on kind of the big picture components, the detailed components, and then, of course, talking a little bit about next steps, implementation, and how the IRA will or will not impact the 2023 reauthorization of the Farm Bill. So I want to start with just a bit of framing. This is not a perfect bill, as Mark mentioned, but overall, certainly from the NSAC perspective, this is a huge, huge win that we have spent not only the past 2 years working on, along with all of you and so many others, but decades, as Mark alluded to. So a huge, huge win and a positive step forward. But to follow on an analogy, Mark mentioned the good, the bad, and the ugly. Like with any movie sequel, the first one's often really good. The second one tends to not be so good. So we have work ahead in a follow through in the implementation, both through implementation itself and the Farm Bill, to ensure that the investments that are included in the IRA actually have the impact that we hope they will. So a huge, huge win. We should celebrate, cheers, but there's a lot of really important work coming in the months, the weeks, months, and years ahead to ensure that that is in fact the case. So I know y'all are the experts on a lot of this. You've been keeping up with the news. Some of you have probably read the text of the bill itself, but I wanted to start by grounding everyone and refreshing ourselves on some of the big picture components of what made it in to the IRA, what didn't make it in that many of us were advocating for, some of those bigger picture pieces before diving into the details of the ag conservation pieces. And then I know Dania will dig into some other pieces in detail as well. So to start off, $20 billion, as you've seen mentioned time and time again, was included in the Inflation Reduction Act for agricultural working lands conservation programs. All of that funding is targeted towards climate specificity, right? We'll talk a little bit more about that later. There were provisions included for debt relief for distressed farmers at $3.1 billion, $2.2 billion for financial assistance to farmers who have experienced discrimination in the past due to USDA. Dania, I know we'll speak more to that later, as well as on other pieces. Drought relief. There's a significant investment in this bill, upwards of $4.5 billion for drought relief, drought mitigation efforts. $4 billion of that drought relief money was actually the subject of much discussion in the final week leading up to passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, involving Senator Sinema, Senator Feinstein, in a late attempt to draw that additional funding for drought relief from the agricultural conservation funding that ended up being $20 billion, but there was actually a late push to have that additional drought funding withdrawn from agricultural conservation funding. That ultimately didn't end up being the case, thankfully, due to NSAC and others that we worked with in pushing back against that, not to the detriment of drought relief funding. It's very, very important, but wanted to maintain agricultural conservation funding. Elsewhere within the USDA portfolio, or the Senate and House Agriculture Committee portfolio and jurisdiction, about $20 billion included for a wide variety of things, ranging for funding for rural electric co-ops to transition to more clean energy and energy efficient structures, Also $5 billion for climate smart forestry, including things like planting trees in urban areas and a wide variety of things. So that is a quick summary of some of the bigger pieces that were included. As many of you know, this was a package that developed over the course of 2 years, if not a little bit longer, depending on how you look at it. So those were the big pieces that ultimately made it in, not all inclusive, but some of the key highlights that we thought worth mentioning here. What are some of the pieces that didn't make it in that were part of those earlier discussions? A few things that I wanted to highlight for you here. Agriculture research. There were billions of dollars in investment in food and agriculture research through a variety of programs, some that NSAC works particularly closely with, including the SARE program, the Agriculture and Food Research Initiative, the AFRI program, and the Organic Research Extension Initiative, the OREI program. Those are just examples of programs that were funded actually fairly significantly and importantly in previous iterations of Build Back Better IRA that didn't receive funding in this final package. Another example, urban agriculture. There were significant investments in urban agriculture in the Office of Urban Agriculture in earlier iterations of Build Back Better or IRA that didn't make it through to this final threshold. The final piece here that I would mention of things that didn't make it in, this is not an exhaustive list, and I'm sure there's more other folks will add, but is components of nutrition funding and nutrition assistance. Many of our allies here in the food and farm space in Washington, D.C. Made a push to include important child nutrition priorities, including the extension of USDA's waiver authority, issues focusing on meal eligibility and expansion at no charge for students, and then a nationwide summer EBT program. So those are all things that the nutrition community pushed for to include both early on and particularly late in the process of the IRA that ultimately were not included in the package. So hopefully that quick overview helps situate you in some of the bigger picture dynamics of what ultimately ended up being in IRA. Now I want to spend a few minutes digging into the agricultural conservation pieces of IRA, which NSAC is certainly within our bailiwick, and we've spent a lot of time analyzing and advocating on in recent months and in recent years. So now that we have that high level grounding, let's dig into the programs. So IRA invests in 4 conservation programs: the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, RCPP, and the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, otherwise known as ASEP. So 4 programs receive nearly just over $18 billion. It's actually $18.05 billion for those 4 programs. I'm going to touch on some common themes that exist in the funding and the different pieces for those programs, and then I'll touch on some differences. So first, the common themes for those 4 programs. First and foremost, climate language, climate targeting language. Each program within the text itself has specific language which targets the funding for those individual programs with towards climate mitigation. So I'm going to read just a brief second of it here, just so you have a sense of what this sounds like, because it's going to be important for some of the other points we make later on. So the funding is targeted towards, in CSP's case, 1 or more agricultural practices, enhancements or bundles that USDA determines directly improve soil carbon, reduce nitrogen losses, reduce, capture, or avoid or sequester carbon dioxide, methane, or nitrous oxide emissions associated with agricultural production. That language is identical in CSP, in EQIP, and it's nearly identical, although there are some slight tweaks in RCPP and ASEP. By our interpretation, the differences in the climate prioritization language between RCPP, ASEP, and the other programs is really more reflective of the differences in how those programs operate, not necessarily a language tweak that significantly impacts the extent to which we believe the climate language could be successful in targeting these investments towards climate mitigation. So that is a common theme across all of those, across those 4 programs, the climate prioritization language. And we'll come back to that in just a little bit. Funding for all 4 of those programs, they're funded with new appropriations. So this is an appropriation for fiscal years 2023. So starting in just about a month here, a month and change, through fiscal year 2026. So for 4 fiscal years, each of these programs receives a new appropriation of money. A couple of things to note that are worth noting about that. The way the legislation spends that money, stair steps it up over time. So for each program, they receive a smaller amount in FY23, working towards FY26 when they receive the highest level of funding that program receives within the IRA. That's really important to impacts on 2023 Farm Bill reauthorization. So keep that piece in mind. One other thing that's actually worth flagging within the funding bucket is the bill makes specific mention time and time again that these funds are meant to be additional to what USDA is already spending. So there isn't any mixing of these funds with current USDA funds that are being authorized by Congress. So you can think of them as separate, and it's an insurance that these funds are in fact additional to what's already being spent, not some other, not something else. A couple other things that are worth mentioning in terms of common themes across those 4 programs. It's a quirk and it's buried within the conforming amendments, but in order to actually spend the money, invest this money for these programs, they had to reauthorize each of these programs through 2023. So if you're a wonk and read the text, you'll see that each of these programs is actually not prematurely, but what's the right word here? Has been reauthorized in advance of the 2023 Farm Bill reauthorization. We understand they had to do that due to a budgeting quirk and working with the Congressional Budget Office, which actually scores these proposals. But nonetheless, it's actually a dynamic where if for some reason the 2023 Farm Bill reauthorization process fell apart, for whatever reason, you could pick one, these programs, those 4 are actually already reauthorized through 2031, which is highly irregular and fairly rare. There are implications for that. We'll touch on that in just a minute. So those are the several common themes across these 4 programs. Let me touch on some even more specific and granular pieces that are unique to one or maybe a couple of different programs. Both the Conservation Stewardship Program, CSP, and the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP, currently have payment limits structured in a way so that a farmer or an applicant toward that program is capped out at a certain amount over a certain period of time. At NSAC, we're supportive of those payment limits, and in part in an effort to make sure that program resources reach a wide variety of people. The IRA fails to extend payment limits beyond FY23. So this means that any date beyond FY23, either for the mandatory reauthorized money that I just mentioned to 2031, or the new funds, there are no payment limits for CSP and EQIP that are included as a part of that. This is something at NSAC that we weren't thrilled to see, and is definitely falls in the bucket for us of problematic, and something that fits within. This is one of the reasons it's not a perfect bill. So that's something within the subtext of the language that's worth noting. For those of you who are familiar with the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or EQIP, you'll know that there is a livestock, set aside a livestock requirement of a certain percentage of funding for within EQIP needs to be dedicated to livestock, investing in livestock, infrastructure and production. The IRA waives that. So there is no EQIP livestock requirement within the new funds. Within the reauthorization of EQIP, that continues to go forward, but for the over $8 billion that's put into EQIP through the IRA, that 50% livestock set aside does not apply. From NSAC's perspective, that's a positive and that's a win. A couple more things to note here. The Conservation Innovation Grants Program, which supports the development and testing of promising new conservation approaches. SIG, Conservation Innovation Grant Program, is a sub-program of EQIP. A really popular program. NSAC is really supportive of it, does a lot of great work in, again, testing out those new conservation approaches and working to scale them up for wider consumption across the country. SIG is actually doubled in funding within the new funds. So SIG receives $25 million a year currently. In any new money that is spent through the IRA, SIG is doubled up to $50 million a year. And within that, SIG actually gives priority to applications that utilize diet and feed management to reduce methane emissions from ruminants. One more thing that I want to mention, and this pertains particularly to RCPP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. RCPP is currently funded by the 2018 Farm Bill at $300 million every year. The IRA gives RCPP $4.95 billion. That's a big scale up. And so one of our concerns, we're supportive of the RCPP program. However, one of the concerns and kind of outstanding questions is how quickly and effectively can RCPP actually get that money out the door and spend that level of money. Prior to the final iteration of the IRA, RCPP funding was actually a tick higher. The Senate Ag Committee ran into issues with CBO and actually had to scale it back. But one of the things they did within the nuance of that program was waive the cap on alternative funding arrangements within that program, which allow for greater flexibility in funding and getting it out the door through the program. So they actually did some interesting tweaks to that program in order to help it get funding out the door more quickly. Nonetheless, we still harbor some concerns, and we'll be watching closely about how effectively that program is able to spend that amount of money out the door, particularly when it's not used to that scale. So those are, for the 4 programs, CSP, EQIP, RCPP, and ASAP that the IRA invests in, those are the highlights that I really wanted to hit in terms of commonalities and differences. A couple other really quick things to mention here. I know I'm getting low on my time here, so I'll make this brief. In addition to those 4 programs, there's 2 other components of funding within the ag conservation bucket. One is $1 billion for conservation technical assistance, which supports staffing capacity at NRCS and USDA to actually implement, carry out the conservation programs that we were just referring to. So that funding is much needed, and we're incredibly supportive of that. The final piece here is a greenhouse gas inventory assessment program, which has long been in many iterations of Build Back Better. The earlier versions included $600 million for this. The past IRA version includes $300 million for this program, which will live in the office of the chief economist, and will actually do some really important work. Many of you are familiar that soil carbon sequestration is positive. It's a key way we can respond to the climate crisis, but we need more science on what that looks like, and it varies from county to county, from region to region. So this is a really important piece that's going to help assess field-based data in terms of carbon sequestration and reductions in carbon dioxide. That's the detailed portion. A couple other things that I wanted to cover, but before I move on from that piece, at NSAC here, we have we have a bunch of sharp staff, but I wanted to single out Kathy Day and Jesse Womack, who lead our conservation and climate work here at NSAC. I'll drop my email in the chat a little bit later. If you have additional detailed questions, really wanted to wonk out or nerd out, we're the place to go, and particularly Kathy and Jesse would love to help answer any questions and work with you on anything that comes up. 2 more things that we wanted to walk through, and these are really important. Implementation of the IRA and what we expect it's going to look like, what we know and what we don't know, and impacts on the 2023 Farm Bill. So implementation. This is a little nuanced, so bear with me here. So as I mentioned, the funding is available for those 4 programs beginning in FY23, which starts in about a month. The climate prioritization language, I read it to you there. Maybe that went in one ear and out the other, but our read of the climate prioritization language USDA has the responsibility to implement that language, but the way in which it's written leaves sufficient flexibility or need to determine exactly what that language means. And so I think one of the biggest, if you want to call it a fight, if you want to call it a debate, conversation, one of the biggest conversations that's already happening here in policy circles, particularly in DC, is the conversation over implementing this funding in a way that most effectively succeeds at climate mitigation. As you can imagine, particularly those of you with climate expertise or experience, there's a wide variety of solutions which contribute to climate mitigation and adaptation in varying effective or quick ways. There's my timer. Varying effective in quick ways. So the work we have cut out for us here at NSAC and as part of a broader community is to work with USDA, work with stakeholders, work with Congress to make sure that implementation of that language and ultimately the funding, how funding moves through these programs to various conservation practices is done so in a way, and this is speaking from the NSAC perspective, that obviously effectively contributes to climate mitigation. That's one of the things that we're all aiming for, but does not do that to the extent where blinders are on, and that is the only thing that we're focusing on. If that is the only criteria, then we lose some of the other positive benefits, whether it be in terms of water quality, in terms of soil quality, or in terms of equity and how these programs are implemented. That's going to be a big challenge coming up within the implementation process. You'll see a lot of organizations, some have already done it in the weeks and the months ahead, to begin to weigh in on that in a very public way of which agricultural practices, from their perspective, deserve implementation and deserve to be a source of this funding. Huge conversation that's coming up. Here's the outstanding question. Exactly how USDA is going to go about implementing that funding and under what timeline. So we can assume, I think to some reasonable degree, that there will be some sort of rulemaking process. Exactly what that's going to look like, the timing of it, remains an outstanding question and something we're actively tackling here at NSAC, as I know many others are. The final piece that, and obviously happy to answer questions, and I know there'll be a great conversation. The final piece that we wanted to address here is the biggest question, I think, is the impact of the IRA on the 2023 Farm Bill reauthorization. From the biggest picture standpoint, from my perspective, this fundamentally changes the conversation that we were going to have in the Farm Bill. Up until IRA passing, what we were hearing from Ag Committee staff left and right was no new money for this Farm Bill. Introduce your marker bills, write your programs, do your work in a way that recognizes there's not going to be additional money to play with. And so we were expecting, up until recently, to be in an environment where money would be shifted around to some degree, but there wouldn't be new money, if not not much at least. IRA fundamentally changes that, because now we're not having that conversation. We're having a conversation of, oh, there's all this new money. How is it going to be spent? Which brings me to the impacts on the 2023 Farm Bill. How the IRA money is going to be spent, it is not a safe assumption to think, oh, that's going to be implemented by USDA and it's going to be spent out over those fiscal years. What we're fully expecting is it's not 100% certainty, but we're expecting the House and Senate Agriculture Committees to rescind the money. We're at least expecting them to seriously consider it, if not do it, to rescind the money that was allocated, particularly to the programs that I mentioned that are within their jurisdiction, rescind that money and either spend it on those programs and other similar programs, or otherwise reallocate it within the Farm Bill. The money that will be available to rescind and reallocate is only the money within IRA that is unspent at the time the Farm Bill is being written and passed. So as a rule of thumb, if you wanted to kind of calculate the numbers, you could say anything within IRA that is tagged for FY24 and beyond, you could reasonably add those numbers up and say, well, if the committees wanted to, in writing the Farm Bill, they could make the decision that all of that money is going to be put back into the Farm Bill in a way that we believe, if they so choose, could create baseline depending on the way they choose to invest it in a wide variety of programs. This is also a component of the process that it's really important to keep in mind that the upcoming midterm elections are going to, and particularly control of the Senate, are going to dictate a lot of what this looks like. It's not out of the question that this IRA funding could be reallocated to Title I commodity programs within the Farm Bill. There's nothing that says it has to stay with these programs, and even with a climate tag. Some of that is very much up in the air, and is part of the reason why we say the follow-up work is really essential in defining just how successful this is. So I know I've gone way over time, and people are probably asking me to hand it over to Dania. So I will pause. I'm going to hand it over to you, Dania. Anything we didn't get to, I'd love to address in the Q&A towards the end or following up individually.
Thanks, Mike. That was great. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I didn't want it to end because I do like nerding out on the language myself. So I'll be following up with you. But again, Dania Davey, I'm the Director of Land Retention and Advocacy at the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, she, her pronouns, and I'm on Creek land today. And if you've heard me speak in the past year, you've probably heard me mention the importance of the debt relief program that was provided under American Rescue Plan Act, Section 1005, which was challenged in about 13 lawsuits. The Federation did have the opportunity to intervene, and we filed a motion for summary judgment, a pretty strong one, if I do say so myself, but unfortunately we'll never know how a judge would have interpreted that section, because the first thing that jumped out to us in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act, despite all of its many significant opportunities where climate is concerned, was the repeal of Section 1005 of the American Rescue Plan. And I will share in the chat a Federation conversation episode, the most recent episode, it just went out today, of me interviewing a family of Native American ranchers that accepted the debt relief, and now they basically are dealing with the aftermath of what happens when you bank on your financing being in a particular way. And as a farmer, as ranchers, you probably are aware how sensitive farming is to financing. And so I want you all to give a listen to that, because they can kind of amplify the sadness that we all feel, those of us who are working to protect Section 1005. And I think it's really important, just as a note, that this is really not just an issue about a farm loan program. It's really a question of how we're going to approach addressing racial equity moving forward. And that's probably the biggest departure from this administration's language going into these negotiations that we were disappointed with seeing coming out of the Inflation Reduction Act. So we have a listen to that. I'm going to go specifically into the sections of the Inflation Reduction Act that address discrimination and debt. There's been a lot of press, and there's been a lot of folks touting how this is going to save farmers of color from detrimental outcomes, and that is just not apparent from the text. And so, like Mike said, this is really going to come down to implementation, and I'm going to go through the language as well as some of the concerns and some of the recommendations that the Federation has. So Section 22006 appropriates $3.1 billion for loan modifications for, quote, distressed direct and guaranteed borrowers. So one of the things that we were concerned about going into the Build Back Better negotiations was that the focus was exclusively on direct borrowers. So it is encouraging that both direct and guaranteed borrowers will be considered for these loan modifications. And there's language that gives the Secretary discretion to expeditiously assist these farmers whose agricultural operations are at financial risk. That's the text. That's the language. We're going to go into some of the shortcomings. And those funds, that $3.1 billion, is available through September 2031. Section 22007E appropriates $2.2 billion for one or more nonprofit organizations to implement a program to provide financial assistance, and that's a quote, a program to provide financial assistance to farmers, ranchers, or forest landowners. To be eligible for the financial assistance, a farmer, rancher, or forest landowner must prove that they experienced discrimination before January 1st, 2021. Only discrimination in farm lending programs would be considered, so nothing from NRCS or rural development, just the lending programs. And the financial assistance is capped at $500,000 per farmer, rancher, or forest landowner who is able to prove their experience of race-based of discrimination. Any form of discrimination can be proven, and that funding is also available through September 30th, 2023. And I just want to pause for a moment because some of this language is what I was speaking to in terms of undermining our opportunities for achieving racial equity. So there's no language whatsoever speaking about socially disadvantaged farmers or ranchers or any alternative language that may be more likely to survive constitutional scrutiny. And so the concern in section 22.006 is that they use the terms distressed and financial risk. Another red flag term is expeditiously. Expeditiously would be a good thing if we didn't know that there was so much discrimination happening at the local levels where these loan modification decisions will be made. And the term distressed in the FSA interpretation of that is a farmer or rancher who anticipates missing a payment, but is not yet delinquent. How does that affect the farmers and ranchers who were entitled to the debt relief? Well, first of all, this is a loan modification program and not a debt forgiveness program. And so there's going to be a lot of paperwork, a lot of bureaucracy. There's really nothing streamlined about any loan modification program I've ever seen, and especially no loan application process I've ever seen coming out of FSA. So it's going to be very important for advocates to be a part of the process. I know that we weren't contacted and none of the advocates were contacted with regard to these sections. We were told that they didn't want to get our hopes up, but it's really concerning that terms like distress that have a particular meaning to FSA could mean that those folks who are delinquent, especially those 17,000 farmers who received those debt relief letters, they were told that no adverse action would be taken against their operation for missing those payments. And so all of those folks who relied on those assurances, it was on the FSA website, those folks would be considered delinquents. And financial risk really opens up the pool in a very broad sense to any farmer, regardless of race. And so now that same $3.1 billion pool, you see it starting to shrink when you think about the ways in which other programs like the COVID relief benefits, when those were expeditiously provided, they went 98% of them went to white farmers and ranchers. So oftentimes when expeditious relief is provided, it follows the same channels of what has already and always been done. So we're very concerned that in trying to honor this expeditious goal, that the same ways in which discrimination in the classic sense have played out at the local FSA offices is what we're going to see again playing out in the implementation of this section. So that's definitely a section to pay attention to and to support the advocates that are trying to bring those solutions for to USDA. Going into is that, I'm sorry, it sounds like that's not me.
Sorry, Danny, just if everyone could have put their mutes on, I think it's just an error microphone.
Okay. So that is the program that the loan modification program is basically the alternative to section 1005. So it takes it from putting the blame squarely on the institution for its prior acts of race-based discrimination and now shift that burden to the individual. And we see that really underscored in the section 22.007E, where we're providing financial assistance of up to $500,000. Now, the concerns there are that financial assistance is not defined and it's not clear. And I asked pointedly whether or not a farmer would be able to receive a check for $500,000 if they showed their discrimination or proved their discrimination, and was told that that's not necessarily how the program will work. It could be all sorts of wraparound services provided by a community-based organization. So there's language that's out there that's telling farmers and ranchers that this could be a way to get, get a payout of $500,000. That is not in the text of the IRA. And we really need to be careful about getting farmers' hopes up, because based on conversations, that is not the intention of why it's described as financial assistance, as well as the fact that discrimination doesn't refer to any of what we've come to know as the civil rights protected classes, gender, race, ethnicity. The ones that we've all come to appreciate are basically out the window, and anything kind of goes. I hate to say that, because as we know, there are always groups that are underrepresented, and there's always the need for representation in programs, but that is to the detriment of the established understanding that we have of discrimination. So there is that risk that someone could experience bad customer service and feel that that is discrimination, in the same way that the white farmers who challenged the constitutionality of Section 1005 felt that the program was racist on its face. And so I think that that kind of language steps us back as a country away from where we were a couple years ago, when we were really talking about racial equity. The language has slowly but surely shifted to just equity, and equity means a lot of different things. And it's going to be really important that advocates have the opportunity to be supported all the way through the implementation process, because this is one that, unfortunately, there are 17,000 farmers that are facing the risk of foreclosure. There is no language about extensions of the moratorium. Even if someone starts applying for a loan modification, it's not really clear whether or not that'll stop the clock on the process of getting a loan modification. And so we still anticipate at least some degree of farm and land loss. And to that point about how funders can be involved in the process, I would just uplift to you all that, it's great to get these wins. Last week, we were awarded to be one of the technical service and outreach provider for the air property relending program, as well as with a partnership with Shared Capital Cooperative. We'll be supporting them as an intermediary of that program. Now, those of you who remember the last Farm Bill cycle, that was actually passed in the 2018 Farm Bill. And it's taken 5 years of advocacy and lots of conversations to get it to the point where now we're able to implement it. And so, especially when you're looking at programs that are targeted towards addressing fundamental race-based discrimination in agriculture, there's a lot of pushback. And if we maintain the status quo, if we legislate in a way that yields to the most conservative elements of our society, then all we'll do is continue to perpetuate the racism that I think we as a nation are just ready to get over with and move beyond. And I just don't think that it's a necessary step that we can get to without intentionality. And we have a variety of recommendations about the considerations that should be made about the organizations that implement the discrimination claims process. But unfortunately, we have significant concerns. Personally, I was involved in Pig for Two, Keep Siegel, Garcia, and Love class settlement implementation. The application was 24 pages long, and I had to fly all over America just to help folks fill out the application. Whenever there's an adjudicator, there's going to be some evidentiary basis. And for a lot of our folks, their evidence is just, I walked into the office, asked for a loan application, was told there were no funds available. There's really not a very airtight way of tracking the ways in which race and gender discrimination occur in these local offices. And so there's a lot of opportunity here, learning from the Air Property Relending Program lesson from the 2018 Farm Bill. It's not just about supporting Farm Bill advocacy. It's walking it all the way through implementation, appropriations, and making sure that each of these wins that we're so excited about with the rest of the IRA don't fall into that quagmire of not being adequately implemented in ways that achieve the goals that we all have for this country. And I'm happy to answer any questions, and I will turn it over to Ferd. Did Ferd join? Okay.
Ferd, are you with us?
I'm with you. Sorry. Can you hear me all right? Good. I've had trouble. I was on. First I applaud both of you. You did a great job going through all of this. I will be brief, probably touch on some of the same points Mike did. I missed some of them, Mike, sorry about that. But really glad to be with you. And let me just touch on a few things quickly. First, a big amen and amen to the last comment about implementation and appropriations, seeing it all the way through. It's so critical to this work, and can't say enough about that. Let me just zoom out big picture. I think Mike did great setting up the context of the big picture. I just would add that, and maybe somebody already said this, but according to the administration's estimates, that the bill overall puts us on the path to be roughly 40% below 2005 emissions by 2030, which is short of the goal of 50%, but getting closer. And just a point that by their estimates, again, the administration estimates, ag is about 10% of that, which is, I suppose, appropriate since ag in the US is about 10% of total emissions. So I guess that means we're right on target. Again, I know this has been said, but I think it's important to, pause ever so briefly to mourn all the things that got ditched from Build Back Better, including all the nutrition assistance, housing assistance, healthcare assist, most of the healthcare assistance, childcare tax credits, all of that stuff. So I won't belabor that point, but I'll also just note that also lost were almost all of the tax reform provisions, including ones that would have had a really big impact on reducing farmland consolidation and concentration. And the agricultural lobby as a whole, of course, opposed those provisions. They were successful in getting them out, but on the progressive ag side, I do mourn that loss. So I just wanted to note that. And also the loss of the ag research provisions, all of which were geared at climate research and will be difficult, much more difficult than, say, conservation programs to win back in the Farm Bill context, though I think we definitely do need to try to do that. Just a few other comments about the conservation section. Again, this funding ramps up from 2023 next year to 2026. I wish I had a slide to show you, but if you look at it on the slide, there's this incredibly dramatic drop off in 2027 for budget authority, and that drop off, which is throughout the bill, is amplified even more because of all the ARPA and other pandemic assistance that the Tom Vilsack USDA has been turning into, assistance for organic, assistance for new and beginning farmers, assistance for small and medium scale meat processing, local food procurement, and on and on and on and on. All of those things are temporary. It's a reasonable amount of money for right now, but as soon as it's used up, and there's nothing in the Farm Bill at this point to replace that. So it's sort of going into the 2023 Farm Bill with a double cliff. You have temporary climate change, conservation and renewable energy and forestry money, and you've got even more temporary intriguing food systems work that the department has been rolling out, including today's $500 million that came out today for socially disadvantaged farmer type issues. So anyway, enough said about that, but that really puts the onus on trying to get the Farm Bill baseline, the permanent Farm Bill baseline, in other words, the funding that runs each and every Farm Bill forever until Congress changes its mind, trying to put this new money, the IRA money, into permanent baseline. I think Congress will be derelict, the Ag Committee will be derelict in its duties, and we will be derelict in our duty as advocates if we don't make a full-on effort to turn this temporary money into permanent money. That means slowing out the spending rate. So instead of throwing lots of dollars out in 2 or 3 short years, it means moving it out over a greater period of time. But that also means that funding will be there ad infinitum till whenever Congress decides to change it sometime in the future. Nothing is more important than securing Farm Bill baseline. Those of you who helped fund and helped us secure permanent funding for many of the smaller programs that, were going Farm Bill to Farm Bill, and we had to find money for it each and every year to keep it alive. The last Farm Bill in 2018 turned a lot of those into permanent funding, and that makes life a lot easier. So I think we can't emphasize that point enough. It may sound like the kind of thing that is, in the weeds, decided by a few people. There's some truth to that, but I think a broad campaign needs to be mounted. Congress needs to be pushed. And in the process of making that funding long-term and permanent, we can also hopefully make improvements, because there's a lot of improvements, I think, that could still be made from what went into the bill. And then, as Mike mentioned, we'll see what happens in November, but assuming Republican control of at least one body, I think there will be probably a fairly full-on attempt to take some IRA dollars and turn them into commodity subsidy dollars in Title I. And that will also, it will split the farm community. It will probably even split some more progressive farm organizations in half, because there'll be a lot of pent-up demand for increases in reference prices and other things that will cost money in Title I. So I think there needs to be a dramatic campaign to keep conservation, renewable energy, and forestry money where they are and not move them to other purposes. So that's all I'll say about that. A little bit more in the weeds on conservation. One point is that the $3.25 billion that were put into the Conservation Stewardship Program, which in my humble opinion is the most important conservation program that we have, that $3.25 billion is less than half of what Congress cut from CSP in the last two farm bills. So it doesn't even make up 50% of what they previously cut, whereas all the other increases are actual increases over and above previous farm bill levels. So that's just an important point for perspective. I put great emphasis on the point Mike already made, that the payment limits in the working lands programs were not extended. That means we need to proactively fight to put them back into law in 2023. That's a harder task than if it was already there and somebody would have to move to take it out. I think that's incredibly important. And related to that, in the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, they eliminated a provision that NSAC fought hard for in the last Farm Bill to limit the number of what's called alternative financing arrangements within RCPP to no more than 15 a year. The IRA takes that limit off. It should not have ever passed the Senate parliamentarian because it's a purely policy issue with no funding implication. But the important implication is that companies, agribusiness that has been beating the drum for proposals into the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodity Program at USDA, that have been fighting for the Growing Climate Solutions Act, that the removal of that limit on AFA combined with the removal of the payment limits will allow companies to have, I think, the upper hand on getting government money that they can then decide on their own how they're going to use. And there'll probably be a division of the House within the conservation community as to whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. My personal view is that's a bad thing. And so I think that's something to really be on the lookout for. I will also just very briefly mention that the Conservation Reserve Program was not included for funding in the IRA, but was extended until 2031, like the rest of the programs in the IRA. I think there will be a debate over CRP funding in the 2023 Farm Bill. I'm paying particular attention to that because the Perennial Agriculture and Agroforestry Coalition that's slowly evolving is going to be putting forth a proposal for a major agroforestry initiative within CRP, which I'm quite excited about, but will take a fair amount of advocacy to win the day, especially since there's no additional CRP funding in the IRA. Yeah, I'll just, there's other things I'll say, but I think we should get to Q&A. I'll just mention for those that follow the renewable energy beat, the win here for the Rural Energy for America program is really big. It's $2 billion in terms of money. Equally important, the cost share rate, which in REAP has always been 25%. So in other words, 75% of the cost of solar or wind or geothermal on farm or in small rural communities, 75% had to be, put up by the farmer or the business owner. Now it's going to be 50%. So that's a really big and important change. And they also put in several $100 million worth of technical assistance money that hopefully NGOs and businesses that are trying to do this can now use to go out there and help people do the application, submit the proposal, get the engineering done, and move on. So it's a really big deal in the energy title of the Farm Bill. And I'll just stop there and let you go to Q&A.
Great, thank you, Ferd. Thanks all three of you. I think you did a tremendous job of taking some pretty wonky stuff and then bringing it to a level that at least I felt was, it worked pretty good for me. So thank you. All right, we have lots of questions, some that came over the chat, some that were just passed on directly to Tracy and me. So we'll get right to that. And first off, the first one, Karen Harris. I'm wondering if you wanted to unmute yourself, if you'd be willing to express your question verbally.
Yes, hi. Thanks all three of you. It was really interesting. And you touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the implementation phase in terms of these are big buckets of money that presumably organizations need to apply for, or maybe farmers directly. I'm not sure. I'm curious. It strikes me that it's possible that philanthropy has a role to play in building the capacity of those institutions to avail themselves to get access to this money. So I'm curious if that's true and in what ways you can imagine that playing out. That's my main question. I was also going to ask a question about defense if we lose Congress, if Congress changes, how much defense is needed. But implementation is my bigger question. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I can chime in with a couple of quick thoughts and then ask others to chime in as well. I think, particularly from our perspective, thinking of the programs that farmers access directly from NRCS, EQIP and CSP. I think there are several main things that you can kind of think about in terms of the push that we're going to need to make during the implementation process. So one is really the component of helping farmers to understand how the updated changes to the program, the extent to which climate friendly, climate smart practices are prioritized in the coming funding cycles. So there's work there to kind of get the word out to farmers, in terms of understanding the updated changes to the program. Program outreach overall, especially with farmer communities who are underrepresented. So I think those two kind of go unserved or underserved. And then I think the final piece is, this is, as Dania mentioned, the technical assistance piece and supporting those organizations who are actually working with growers, working with the people who are accessing those programs, I think tend to need resources to keep up that work in their engagement with farmers and stakeholders in that way. So those are three things that I would mention. I'm sure Dania, you have others to add.
Yeah, you set me right up. So piggybacking on what Mike said, I think that the implementation of the loan modification program is going to be there's going to need to be a lot of technical assistance that's provided to folks that are applying for the loan modifications, as well as the outreach to let them know to go to their local FSA office to apply for those funds. I think there's also, tangentially related to that, that. There's funding opportunity that is for defending the foreclosures that we're expecting to be coming down the pike for those who may not be eligible for that loan modification program. In terms of the implementation of a discrimination claims process, woo. I think that the technical assistance people need technical assistance people, and the lawyers need lawyers, right? Because it's going to be very difficult to tailor something that is appropriate for the ag context, that is for discrimination that has happened prior to 2021. I just expect a lot. When I was doing Pigford 2, there were so many folks with so many stories, and just trying to help folks articulate those stories. So there's technical assistance that's required there, but also in just the design of like, what is the evidentiary basis? What are the adjudicators' qualifications? Are they going to be lay folks? Are they going to be attorneys? Are they going to be judges? Is there going to be appeals process? If the USDA makes the final decision, who do you appeal to if the USDA makes a decision that you don't agree with? So there's some huge gaps in both of those programs. And my worry is, especially for those that are in the most dire financial need, those solutions won't come quickly enough. It took a really long time for the claims form for Pigford 2, Garcia, and Love, and Keep Siegel to be developed. I really don't feel extremely confident about that being an expeditious process this time around, especially when we're going to have possibly additional categories of folks claiming discrimination that might not have been protected classes previously. So there's lots of research opportunities around discrimination claims processes, the scrutinizing and implementation or selection of the organizations that will implement it, as well as the technical service providers to the farmers as they develop their statements. And then obviously sitting down with the farmers and making sure that they understand what financial assistance looks like for them.
Great, thank you, both of you. I also want to point out that we also have another expert in the background, Sarah Hackney at NSAC, who's doing a great job of answering some questions in the chat. So one of those questions that Mackie asked kind of goes to this. I wanted to check to see if that question was answered appropriately. And maybe first I'll go to Betsy, who built on that question. So Betsy, if I can turn it over to you, and if you could ask your question, and then we'll keep on going.
Yeah, I've posted a few things. My apologies. It was such wonderful presentations. Thank you. My question, building on Mackie's question, is really going back to what Ferd said. So we have this tension. We want to get the money out to good projects and implementing it right for diversified agricultural systems, building for multiple co-benefits, not just climate. We want to move that fast so it doesn't get preempted by potentially a bad farm bill. On the other hand, there's a danger of that money moving really fast with ultimately, well, I guess this is the question: is there a great danger of the money moving fast without enough caps on payments in some of the programs where the big industrial ag players could grab those funds? And that's a great fear. I just wanted to say, among the climate negotiators, the climate, the kind of the top people are looking at the next COP. They're watching what's happening here, and they are both excited but also worried. And I think so. I'd love. I don't know if it's Ferd or Mike want to speak to that.
Yeah.
And hi, this is Maki. I'll just add to that my original question. Just wondering, is it realistic to encourage that spending to happen quickly, pending an answer to Betsy's question on how safely that could be dispersed, or is this spending fixed by certain time periods?
Yeah, those are really good and important questions. I guess my take on it is, if we tried to spend the money fast, I can almost guarantee it will be spent poorly. And taking this money, which is substantial, an aside, you've probably seen, even the secretary said it the other day, this is the biggest investment in conservation since the Dust Bowl. It's not really true, but okay. The 2002 investment was bigger than this investment, just as a for instance. But anyway, be that as it may, you can't spend. I'm just thinking of the conservation money here, but it probably applies to many other programs as well. spending that amount of money in a short period of time would, the quickest way to do that is to fund every CAFO methane digester and irrigation, mega irrigation project that comes into the NRCS application pool, because those are the big chunks of money that, defining what is climate smart, of course, will be a huge, interesting battle, but, certainly, methane digesters for CAFOs are certainly going to be on that list. There's no way that they're not going to be on that list. You can do those at $2 billion a pop and spend a lot of money pretty fast, but I don't think that's what we want to see. So again, I think the far preferable and better for the climate result is to take the money, make it permanent baseline money, spend it out over the next decade, decade and a half at a rate that the government agents that are in the field could possibly begin to handle. And I think it's important to remember that NRCS is on a huge hiring spree right now. And within a couple of years, more than 50% of field agents in NRCS are going to be new within the last 2 to 3 years, and most of them are going to be under the age of 32 or 30. They're hiring college graduates left and right now. To ask those people to deliver, $20 billion worth of climate program in 3 years is just not going to work. So I would strongly caution that this is a big increase. It can be a big increase, a substantial increase every year over and above what we have. But let's make it permanent so that it just we don't spend in 3 years and then we have nothing. And then everybody will look around and say, how come we're not making the same amount of progress that we made last year? So that's my long and the short of my answer for that. I don't know.
Could I interrupt 1 second? Could you give a 30-second explanation of what baseline funding or permanent funding is and why that's so important?
Yeah, so, currently, I'll use very rough numbers, but currently, congressional baseline is done in decade-long periods. That's why this IRA bill goes to 2031. And so roughly in a decade right now, permanent baseline for the Farm Bill is about $1 trillion. 75 to 80% of that is all in the SNAP program. But that's the permanent baseline. So the next time you write a Farm Bill, that's what you have to deal with, whatever's in the permanent baseline, unless Congress makes an independent judgment that they're going to add more money to the pot or less money to the pot. And most farm bills, they don't add or subtract. You just have whatever the permanent baseline is. So for instance, why this is important, every farm bill between 1985 and 2002, where we created the conservation title, created all the programs that we're talking about in the IRA, all of that money was permanent baseline money in the commodity subsidy title of the Farm Bill that the conservation community advocated for and stole from commodity subsidies and put in the conservation title. That is a difficult thing to achieve, especially in a divided Congress, almost impossible to achieve in a divided Congress. Even in an undivided Democratic Congress, it's not easy to achieve. So creating permanent baseline when you can create it is so important. A great thing that the food stamp community did in, which Farm Bill was it, 2008? No, it was 2002. They got $6 billion in new money, which wasn't a hell of a lot when you consider the cost of the SNAP program. They put in almost all of that $6 billion in the last year of that Farm Bill. So they spent nothing for 4 years to improve SNAP. They put it all in the last year because then that became permanent baseline, and the overall spending for SNAP increased dramatically for the next Farm Bill. Congress did the opposite of that in the 2018 Farm Bill. They cut $5 billion out of the long-term permanent baseline for the Conservation Stewardship Program. And they took that money and used it for other purposes, which was really most unfortunate. So permanent baseline is everything. And we can and we should turn this money into permanent baseline and spend it at what will be a very enhanced clip over what we have today, but will last, potentially last for a century. So that's that.
Thank you. Dania and Mike, thank you, Ferd. And anything more on that topic that you'd like to address?
Yeah, I would just add that, what I think USDA wants to accomplish in terms of the discrimination process and loan modification is some version of an institutional paradigm shift. And I think that that's a similar instinct that NRCS has in terms of diversifying its workforce. But the issue is that when we have institutionalized white supremacy, it really doesn't matter who's behind the desk. They're going to still be implementing choices and decisions and using factors that are based on anti-Blackness and other forms of racism. And so because there's so many unconscious biases that we all just kind of navigate the world with, it's really important for the funding community to think about those types of trainings. There's this dual stressor that we have of trying to move quickly for those people who are in crisis, especially all of us with the climate being in crisis. But then the reality is we don't want to create any systems that it's dependent on which administration who gets what and who benefits from these programs. So we really have an opportunity here, I think, to have some of these conversations and have some of these trainings that can really think about how we all navigate these conversations with whatever biases that we're bringing to bear, especially when it comes to accessing farm programs through the USDA. I think there's a lot of training opportunities, but a lot more dialogue between community members and those folks who are the ones implementing those programs would be a really good way to support some institutional paradigm shift as we implement these programs.
And
I think it was covered beautifully. I'll by Ferd and Dania. I will just add, particularly from the NSAC perspective, kind of going back to the conversation that we started off with these questions and that inherent tension, rushing the implementation process from our perspective. There's a difference between rushing and moving with good pace and following the right transparency and process pieces. As many of you know, the science on all of this isn't settled. So even additionally from that perspective, on the science on the climate side and soil carbon sequestration, rushing could be deeply, deeply problematic. And even though there is this need to start getting this money out the door, to some degree, it's where do we feel better positioned to have this fight? And Ferd was mentioning, the dynamics within a farm bill context. That's in part why the midterms are so important, because it's going to set the final chess pieces for some of those debates. So I would just wanted to add that before we hop on to all of these great questions.
Great. And one question that follows on, particularly from what you said, Dania, is, and what Ferdy mentioned before about the CAFOs. And I think if we want to quantify a greenhouse gas emission reduction, probably one of the best things we can do is put money into CAFOs. And as you mentioned, Danny, about the white supremacy model, it feels like there's a lot of bad practices that are out there. And so if we just look at greenhouse gases, one of the best things we can do is stop those bad practices. And we're ignoring the long-term diversified pasture-based systems that have been out there for a long time. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that versus I feel that danger of trying to mitigate bad things rather than trying to address and recognize and advocate for the good things that are there.
And that's why, even though I was the bearer of bad news on this call in terms of looking at the provisions that we're critical of, I'm extremely excited about the conversation that can be had on the basis of the IRA. I think that this is really a chance for us to make good on these conversations that we've been having for the last few years, in particular since the George Floyd assassination. I think that there is a space that we're all in the climate crisis together. We're all equally under that ultimate harm, but there are disproportionate ways in which the climate crisis affects communities. There are disproportionate ways that public health is impacted by all of these, huge corporate agricultural conglomerates. And so there, I think, is an opportunity here for us to be really strategic about making sure that when we have these conversations about who can really implement agroecological, programs, small farms, sustainable farms, like we can really use this new opportunity to just amplify the messaging that all of us have been working on for decades. And I just think that, every time I'm in one of these spaces, I'm like, I remember back in my day, like there was no climate crisis, right? And so now it's like, here it is. We've been given this gift that it's like almost universally accepted that we all have something to lose, some more so than others. The ways in which, the rates at which people are dying, losing their land, not having access to land, not having access to credit, not having access to conservation programs. Those have a long history based on what was set in place by our founding fathers. And now we have that chance to right those wrongs and steer us on the course of what I think we all dream of the future of this country to be. So I'm really excited. I really think it's a great opportunity to get a lot of folks engaged in those conversations from that vantage point. And yeah, so I think that the implementation conversation is a great invitation for all of us to bring all the stakeholders, especially those whose voices have been left out many times from those conversations, to bring them on this cruise ship that's not going to be speedy, but like at some point we're going to get somewhere that we all enjoy together. So it's really a call to action, and I'm excited about it.
That was great. Dania, that was great. I kind of felt like I should just end the call right now. That was just beautiful. But we have some other great questions I have to get to. And I'm wondering, Pippa, I know you've done a lot of work on trying to figure out how to get the money out there and what philanthropy can do. I'm wondering if I could ask you to verbalize your question that you have in the chat.
Sure. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I've been having some audio issues today. Yeah, I mean, I think to Ferd's point, NRCS going out and getting kind of everyone they can, like we can see it. And I think Dania started to talk about this, like if we change the way that they learn things, they won't do things the old way. So it's not, I don't think, particularly problematic that there's going to be new staff and staff that haven't implemented things the old way. So just wondering, what, if there's a role philanthropy can play, I don't know, community-based groups that train their local staff, or up all the way up to the level here in DC, to help think about what those new NRCS staffers learn. And Betsy chatted me a little bit about it, so I don't know if she wants to chime in too.
I'm all for it. It's something that I've moved a few grants locally to do that, and it has such a huge effect. Of course, they're doing some of this in California, so I think we should really talk with Alyssa Charney, talk with others, Bert and Mike and others, about how could we do that? What would NRCS be open to? That's a really good idea.
Yeah, I love that idea too. I think I'm not sure what the exact answer is, but I think if nothing else, getting new staff to the right farms and the right conferences, and getting them connected to really good researchers would, all of that stuff would really help. I mean, they obviously have a lot to learn just about basic NRCS culture and infrastructure and systems and processes, but they'll get all that internally. But how could you add to that, I think, is a great question.
Great. Anyone else? Okay, thank you. How about I'll love to Kat Taylor has a great shout out to Zach Duchesneau and his work. And Kat, if you are on audio, I am not all that familiar with this, so I'd love to hear a little bit about what you're thinking about.
Well, thanks, Mark. And I hope I understand it well enough to translate. But we had talked to Zach, who's the head of the FSA, of course, about his idea of, instead of farmers and ranchers taking out farm credit, applying to the USDA for the conservation programs, getting into that process, a reimbursement of conservation practice expenses, just shortcut it and extend the loans that they get through FSA and forgive or at least defer principal on the submission of invoices related to eligible conservation practices. So it has the effect of lowering the debt service coverage for the producer in real time, but also it shifts it from a debt model to more of an investment model. So that leaves more of the net income of the farming operations for the farmer or rancher to apply to innovation, especially conservation practices that improve their yield and resiliency over time. I think it's a brilliant idea. I think he already has the authority to do it under his discretion, but he was trying to get it into the Farm Bill, into statute at some point, so that it is, as Ferd was saying, it's there every year kind of thing. I didn't know if it was mentioned in the loan modification program section of the IRA.
It's not mentioned specifically or explicitly, but I think you're right that between existing authorities and the new authority, I think you could probably, I don't think he'd be stepping too far out on the limb to try to make something like that work. I'll also just briefly mention that Abigail Spanberger has a bill to make this codified and allow 3 years of no payment on a loan, the first 3 years, as people try to make the soil health system work, and then they start principal and interest in year 4. Assuming she survives in November and is back, I think she'll be pushing that in the Farm Bill. I helped put that bill together for her, and I think it has some interesting support. I've gotten a fair amount of interest from Republican offices in it as well. So I think it has a potential for making it through.
And of course, speaking of implementation, we have to be sure that socially disadvantaged farmers get farm credit in the first place. But to me, it also could recruit more actors into farming, because it's been such a bad return job for the last several decades because of the industrialization of it all. So like just improving the job so that we reverse the trend of what's the average age of a farmer now is 68 or something like that. But thanks.
Great. Thank you, Kat. I'd love to turn, Betsy kind of initiated some conversation about research and science and what is there and what we hope to be there. Betsy, could I turn to you to kind of ask a question, make a comment on that?
Yeah, I was just composing something for the chat, which I'll post right after I comment, which is, there's this tension between moving the money fast and slow that Ferd and Mike have both spoken to. And from a climate perspective, which is kind of the climate and equity seem to be a big driver, the tension between them, but a big driver for Vilsack. But there is, from the climate perspective, a need to move money, but a need to move money well. And there is a lot of science that shows the superior climate mitigation benefit from diversified farming systems, from agroforestry, from perennial crops, from systems using as little nitrogen as possible, because nitrogen has been shown in a recent study to really undermine soil carbon sequestration. And that, I don't know anywhere where that's been put together. And I would be very interested in co-funding with anyone else interested, a rather quick assembly of some of that data, which points towards moving more of the funds to small and medium-sized producers. And that is not in any way to undermine some really great, larger producers, commodity crop producers who are doing their very best to build healthy soils. And, Walton has led on that, and thank you for that. And it's where most of our ag is. We need to move there, but this is being too long-winded, except to say that I think we have a role to play with the NRCS training, but we also have a role to play in lifting up the research that supports sustainable regenerative agroecological practices. And there is quite a bit there. And if it could help maybe frame some of the debate. So I'm posting I was just writing this. And if anyone's interested, I'd be really interested. I think that could be a good intervention for our community.
Thanks, Betsy. I'll just double down and say how incredibly spot on that is, and it feels really important, and I'm glad you said it. I think one of the things that's running through my mind is this conversation, particularly the one that you're framing in terms of how we invest in climate, that tension between mitigation and adaptation, and how we're incorporating other important components, I think is going to potentially expose or exacerbate new fault lines within some of our communities. That's going to be really important to kind of pay attention to and watch. But I know later today I'm heading to a meeting or into a conversation that we're having here at NSAC, particularly around implementation, but in pulling together some of those pieces, exactly like what you're talking about. So in some ways, quick is going to be a key word in doing that, both in the Farm Bill context and in implementation. But getting those out into the world, particularly as we're receiving pressure increasingly to mitigate, having those other voices out there to not rebut, but to provide additional perspective, particularly from a science perspective, is going to be really, really essential as we get into implementation in Farm Bill.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in. I know I've been too loud on this call, but I don't think it necessarily helps us to say the science isn't in on climate mitigation. The science isn't fully in, but there is a lot of science, and it's a question then of lifting up the science that there's a lot of science that hasn't been incorporated into the IPCC models that is very, very good science that supports diversified farming systems that we're all for. So I think we can go on offense rather than defense, and that's what I encourage us to do.
Great. Thank you for that, Betsy. And I would encourage, if others are interested in this conversation, maybe Betsy and Tracy and Jenny and I can have, welcome that conversation, because I do think that is very important. We're at that time where I'd love to just kind of get the final thoughts from each of the speakers as we go to a close. So Ferd, I prepped you. I thought I'd go to you first. And Ferd, any final thoughts you'd like to leave on this great conversation?
Yeah. Well, just on this research idea, I think it's really important. It was a real shame to lose that money. And I will point out that in the Build Back Better Ag Research section, it was really good, and our community really won a lot of important stuff. So it was sad to see that go. But that's just the funding part. I think the substance is so important, and so much there are probably 10 studies on cover crops and no-till for every one study on perennial agriculture, just as an example. And I don't know what you want to call that, scientific capture by whatever, but it's a problem that I think something, a report that goes directly to that issue and talks about congressional spending priorities relative to it, I think could have an impact. So I like that idea. I guess my biggest thing is this is going to be a wild ride, trying to get IRA implemented at the same time, with lots of debates over what qualifies, what doesn't qualify, who's in, who's out. Lots of implementation issues at the same time, debating a farm bill, at the same time debating whether this funding should stay where it is or move someplace else. So it's going to be a crazy period of time. Coming full circle back to the fact that the IRA left out the nutrition assistance part, I think everybody will appreciate that nutrition assistance will be the number one dividing issue in the next farm bill, as it's been in the last several farm bills. That will have probably more than anything else to do with whether a farm bill gets done in 2023 or doesn't get done in 2023. So I think it's important to form alliances beyond the climate interest, but remember there's nutrition and food security that looms large as well. So I'm kind of rambling here, but I think it's going to be a hell of a 18-month period coming up with lots to do. And back to the point that has been made several times now, that seeing it through implementation, what happens to the funding? Is the funding actually secure? Does money get appropriated? Is appropriate technical assistance and outreach out in the field, or is it not? where do the benefits flow? All of that work is intensive and takes time, and is in the end the most important thing. It's more important really than just winning the provisions per se. So, and the same is true of the upcoming Farm Bill. So really, really excited to see so many people on this call, and I hope that means that there's going to be a great funding backup to these efforts.
Thank you, Ferd. All right, Dania, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. It's gonna, this period of time, the next 2 years or so, give or take, is gonna create some very interesting bedfellows, and I fear that it might result in some very nasty divorces. But I do think that what I would like to see not get lost in the shuffle. During the lockdown, I read a lot of James Baldwin. I felt like that was, his words were really carried me through the isolation. But one of the quotes that has been in my mind a lot recently is, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And I say that to say, we, as Mike said, we're going to unearth some fault lines that we aren't even anticipating going into some of these coalitions and conversations. And I really think it's important that we remember that who that debt relief program was intended to benefit was the very group that was the first to not be consulted when the IRA was being drafted. And so I think it's really critical that we not lose sight of the importance of racial equity throughout our climate and agricultural systems, not just because of the racial disparities that have been tracked forever historically, but just because the future of America is going to be exceptionally diverse. And it's going to be important that we bring to bear all of those understandings, all of those cultural rich histories to bear on solutions. And, you know, going back to a lot of the practices that a lot of peoples of colors were encouraged to shed in the process of assimilation. And so there's a lot of rich rooted history that I think can extend a lot of branches to a lot of folks to bring into some of these conversations that haven't traditionally been a part of the conversation. And I welcome that opportunity. And I'm really grateful to all of you, great panel, and all of you that attended and are interested in this. Continue to support the long walk that we'll have to walk together.
Well, first and foremost, I'm gonna, start getting my sleep.
Thank you, Dania. I'll quickly go over to Mike.
Yeah, I'm gonna start getting my sleep bank going for the next 2 years so we can be rested up. I think just a couple of quick comments. Think of the conversations we were having in food and agriculture 2 years ago, 5 years ago. There are challenges ahead for sure. The nature of the conversations we're having right now, from my perspective, is infinitely better than what was happening so it's important to keep that big picture perspective. Again, a lot of tough work ahead. And I think the only thing that I would reiterate or kind of reframe, those fault lines are going to emerge in new and interesting ways. But as we know, whether it's with regard to racial equity, climate, or other work, or the intersection of those, organizations, many on this call and many others, have been doing that work for decades. So as we look for new fault lines, let's keep our minds open for new alliances and new opportunities to work with communities, organizations that we haven't been, to be stronger collectively. I think, this is clearly a new moment, and we have to be open-eyed and looking for those opportunities in a Farm Bill context and writ large. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, Mike. All right, and I'm going to hand it over to Tracy to just close us out.
All right, thank you so much, everybody. Mark, great job facilitating speakers. It was so great to hear from you all, and really good engagement with everyone participating. Thanks to FORA for working with us on this. There's a lot of follow-up, and there was a lot of content here, so we'll be developing some slides to send out and follow up along with the recording. And also, FORA and us will connect on those follow-up items that we've been seeing people talk about in chat, as well as some others. Very rich content today, very rich discussion, and there's a lot of work ahead. So funders, be squirreling away your dollars to support this kind of advocacy work. They need it. And let's shake out the couch cushions a little bit and see what else we can do there. So Thanks everybody for joining, and we'll be in touch with follow-up.